How early humans survived being sick with no doctors ***. You wake up with a fever of 103. Your throat feels like sandpaper. Every joint aches like you've been in a car accident. In the modern world, this is an inconvenience. You take something from a bottle, you drink some water, you sleep it off, and worst case, you call a doctor who prescribes something with a name you can't pronounce that kills the thing that's making you sick. Now remove all of that. Remove the medicine cabinet. Remove the hospital. Remove antibiotics. Remove the concept of a virus. Remove the idea that anything smaller than a visible insect could possibly hurt you. Put yourself 50,000 years ago with the exact same fever, the exact same infection, the exact same aching joints, and nothing. No doctor. No pharmacy. No germ theory. Just you, your body, and a group of people around a fire who have absolutely no idea what a bacterium is. Here's the thing. They didn't just sit there and hope you survived. This is the assumption embedded in almost every popular idea about ancient illness, that sickness in the deep past was simply a coin flip, that you got sick, and then either your body won or it didn't, and there was nothing in between. That assumption is wrong, and it's wrong in a way that's genuinely fascinating once you look closely at what ancient humans actually did when someone in their group got sick. They had medicine. Not modern medicine, not germ theory medicine, but a real, accumulated, empirically tested body of practice for managing illness that in some cases worked shockingly well and in other cases worked by accident for reasons nobody understood. The story of how humans survived disease before doctors is not a story of helplessness. It's a story of a species doing exceptional detective work with none of the tools we'd consider necessary for that detective work to succeed. Let's start with the body itself. Because before you even get to treatment, ancient humans were dealing with sickness using an immune system that was calibrated completely differently from yours. Modern humans, particularly in wealthy, sanitized, urban environments, have immune systems that developed in conditions of relative microbial isolation. Ancient humans developed their immune systems in conditions of constant, heavy, diverse microbial and parasitic exposure from birth. This matters enormously. There's a concept researchers call the hygiene hypothesis, the idea that a lack of early exposure to a wide range of microorganisms and parasites leaves the modern immune system poorly calibrated, prone to overreaction in the form of allergies and autoimmune conditions that were far rarer in populations with higher pathogen exposure. Ancient humans were essentially training their immune systems continuously from infancy, in an environment where parasitic load was high, exposure to environmental bacteria was constant, and the immune system had to become extremely good at distinguishing real threats from background noise. This doesn't mean ancient humans didn't get sick. They absolutely did, frequently and often fatally. But it does mean their baseline physiological relationship with pathogens was different from ours in ways that shaped how illness actually played out in their bodies. Now let's talk about fever, because fever is one of the most misunderstood aspects of ancient illness management. Modern instinct, even today, is to treat fever as the enemy, something to be brought down immediately. But fever is not a malfunction. It's an evolved defense mechanism. Raising core body temperature makes the internal environment less hospitable to many pathogens and enhances the efficiency of immune cell activity. Ancient humans, without knowing any of the biology, seem to have understood something close to this intuitively. Ethnographic evidence from traditional societies studied across the last 2 centuries shows a consistent pattern: sweating therapies, sitting close to fire, wrapping the sick in hides to induce and sustain a fever rather than suppress it. This wasn't universal, and it wasn't always correct. Sometimes this approach almost certainly killed people through dehydration or heat stroke. But the underlying instinct, that heat was doing something useful rather than something harmful, tracks remarkably well with what we now understand about the immunological function of fever. Let's bring up plant medicine, because this is where the sophistication of ancient illness management becomes genuinely undeniable. The idea that ancient humans stumbled around eating random plants and occasionally got lucky badly undersells what was actually a systematic, tested, transmitted body of botanical knowledge. Willow bark contained salicin, a compound that the human body converts into a substance closely related to modern aspirin. Multiple ancient cultures independently discovered that chewing or brewing willow bark reduced pain and fever. This wasn't a lucky guess repeated once. It shows up in Sumerian medical texts, in ancient Egyptian papyri, in Greek medical writing attributed to Hippocrates, and in the practices of indigenous peoples across North America who had no contact with any of those old world traditions. Independent discovery of the same effective compound across unconnected cultures is not coincidence. It's the signature of systematic trial, observation, and transmission happening in parallel across the species. The evidence goes back much further than written history. Dental plaque recovered from Neanderthal remains at a site in Spain contains chemical traces consistent with poplar bark, which also contains salicin, alongside traces of a mold related to a natural antibiotic compound, in an individual whose skeleton shows signs of a dental abscess and a digestive parasite. This is a Neanderthal, self-medicating with pain relief and a naturally occurring antimicrobial substance, tens of thousands of years before anyone had a word for medicine. Whatever we want to call the cognitive process behind that, it was not blind luck. It was applied knowledge, likely passed down and refined over generations of watching what worked and what didn't. Wound care follows the same pattern of accidental accuracy through sustained observation. Honey shows up across an enormous range of ancient medical traditions, Egyptian, Sumerian, and beyond, as a wound dressing. This looks superstitious until you understand the actual chemistry. Honey has a low water content and high acidity that inhibits bacterial growth, and certain honeys produce hydrogen peroxide through an enzymatic reaction, giving it genuine antibacterial properties. Ancient healers had no concept of bacteria, but they could see, directly and repeatedly, that wounds dressed with honey were less likely to become infected and putrid than wounds left uncovered. That observation, repeated across enough cases over enough generations, became codified practice. It worked. Nobody knew why. It didn't need to be known why to be used correctly. Maggot therapy follows an even stranger version of the same logic. Wounds that became infested with fly larvae in certain conditions were observed, in some traditions, to heal cleaner and faster than wounds that didn't. This seems horrifying until you understand that certain maggot species consume only dead and infected tissue, leaving healthy tissue alone, effectively performing a form of biological debridement. Some traditional healers appear to have recognized this pattern and deliberately allowed or introduced it in specific wound types. This is not a fluke discovered once. Maggot debridement therapy is still used in modern hospitals today, under sterile clinical conditions, because it genuinely works, rediscovered by modern medicine after having been independently arrived at by ancient practitioners with no theoretical framework for why it functioned. Let's bring up something that tends to surprise people: actual surgery. Trepanation, the deliberate boring or scraping of a hole into the human skull, is one of the oldest documented surgical procedures on Earth, with archaeological evidence going back over 7,000 years across multiple unconnected regions. What makes trepanation genuinely remarkable isn't that ancient humans attempted it. It's that a substantial number of trepanned skulls show clear evidence of bone regrowth around the surgical opening, meaning the patient survived the procedure, sometimes for years afterward. This was almost certainly attempted for a mix of reasons, some likely ritual or spiritual, but some almost certainly aimed at treating real physical problems: skull fractures, pressure from bleeding or swelling inside the skull, chronic headaches, or seizures. A procedure this invasive, performed without anesthesia, without any understanding of infection control as we know it, with a documented survival rate meaningful enough to leave healed bone in the archaeological record, tells you that ancient practitioners had developed real procedural skill through repetition, most likely refined by watching which techniques led to survival and which didn't. Now let's talk about something that gets almost no attention in popular discussions of ancient medicine: the instinct to isolate the sick. Long before anyone understood contagion in a biological sense, humans and other primates display a behavioral pattern researchers called a behavioral immune system, an evolved disgust response that triggers avoidance of individuals or things that carry visual and olfactory signals of sickness, lesions, discoloration, the smell of infected wounds, the sound of certain coughs. This isn't a learned social convention. It shows up in infants before they could possibly have been taught it, and in non-human primates who have never received any hygiene education whatsoever. Ancient human groups almost certainly used a version of this instinct to separate contagious individuals from the rest of the group during serious outbreaks, not because anyone understood pathogen transmission, but because the felt sense of danger around visibly sick individuals was strong enough to produce isolating behavior anyway. The disgust response and the survival value of quarantine arrived at the same behavioral outcome through completely different cognitive routes, one instinctive and emotional, one that we'd now describe in the language of epidemiology. But here's where it gets genuinely interesting, because isolation wasn't the whole story, and in many cases it wasn't even the dominant response. The archaeological and anthropological record also shows something that complicates the simple isolation narrative considerably: sustained, long-term care for individuals who were sick or disabled in ways that would have made them a burden rather than a contributor to the group. A Neanderthal skeleton known as Shanidar I, discovered in a cave in what is now Iraq, shows evidence of a withered arm, likely amputated earlier in life, significant hearing loss, and healed but severe skeletal trauma, injuries that would have left this individual unable to fully participate in hunting or physically demanding group activity. And yet the bone shows this person survived for years after these injuries, well into an age considered old by the standards of the time. That doesn't happen through instinct or luck. That happens because a group of people carried this person, fed this person, protected this person, for years, with no immediate practical payoff beyond the value of keeping them alive. This is one of the earliest pieces of evidence we have for something that looks unmistakably like compassionate long-term care, and it predates modern humans entirely. The presence of care like this tells you something important, that the sick weren't simply written off. Illness in ancient human groups triggered a genuine social response, not universal, not always successful, but real, organized, and sustained in ways that required cooperation, patience, and a kind of collective decision that this person's life was worth the ongoing cost of keeping them alive. Let's bring up the role of the healer specifically, because by the time you get to more recent prehistoric and early historic periods, illness management had clearly become specialized knowledge held by specific individuals within a group. Burial evidence from various sites shows individuals interred with unusual collections of items, particular plants, animal parts, tools distinct from typical hunting or domestic equipment, in ways that suggest a recognized role roughly equivalent to what anthropologists call a shaman or medicine person. This person would have been the repository of the group's accumulated knowledge about which plants treated which symptoms, which wounds needed what kind of care, which illnesses tended to resolve on their own and which required intervention. Losing this person to death or injury wasn't just a social loss. It was the loss of a functioning medical library that existed only in one person's memory, which is almost certainly one of the reasons that healers, like elders in general, appear to have been given particular protection and status within many ancient and traditional societies. There's also the psychological dimension of ancient illness care that deserves real attention, because ritual and belief-based healing, the kind of thing that gets dismissed today as pure superstition, had genuine physiological effects that modern medicine now takes seriously. The placebo response is not an illusion. It produces measurable changes in pain perception, in stress hormone levels, in immune markers, through the simple expectation of care and the social experience of being tended to. A sick individual surrounded by a group performing ritual, chanting, physical touch, focused attention, and reassurance was experiencing something that modern research on stress, social support, and healing outcomes would predict produces real physiological benefit: lower cortisol, reduced pain perception, better sleep, faster recovery from the kinds of illnesses where the body's own systems do most of the actual work. Ancient healing rituals almost certainly overstated their own effectiveness for serious infectious disease, but they were quietly doing something real for the enormous category of illness where psychological state and stress hormones meaningfully affect recovery. None of this means ancient illness management was equivalent to modern medicine, and it's worth being honest about that. Infant and child mortality from disease was brutally high. Infections that a course of modern antibiotics resolves in days killed people regularly, sometimes agonizingly slowly, with no way to stop it once it progressed past a certain point. Plague, cholera, and other major epidemic diseases moved through ancient and pre-modern populations with a ferocity that dwarfs anything in the modern experience of illness. The absence of germ theory meant that even good empirical practices coexisted with practices that were actively harmful, and there was no reliable way to distinguish between the two without centuries of accumulated trial and error playing out at the cost of countless human lives. But the overall picture that emerges once you actually look at the evidence is not one of helplessness. It's a picture of a species that, faced with an enemy it could not see, could not name, and could not explain, nonetheless built a working system of observation, treatment, care, and knowledge transmission that kept enough people alive long enough for that knowledge to accumulate across generations. Willow bark for pain, honey for wounds, isolation for the visibly ill, long-term care for the injured and disabled, specialized healers holding the collective memory of what worked. Every one of these practices exists today in a more refined form: salicylic acid in your medicine cabinet, antiseptic wound care in every hospital, quarantine protocols during outbreaks, palliative care wards, medical specialists trained over years to hold the knowledge the rest of us don't have to carry ourselves. Every piece of modern medicine is standing on the shoulders of people who had none of our tools and somehow figured out enough of the truth anyway, through nothing but attention, memory, and the refusal to simply let each other die without a fight.